A landmark report has been published into child sexual exploitation by groups of men in the UK, and the government has decided it will set up a national inquiry after spending months saying there probably wouldn't have to be one. We'll discuss the implications of this on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and I'm joined on the line by my colleague, BBC special correspondent Judith Moritz, who is in Oldham. Hi, Judith.
Hi, Adam.
So I think if we kind of split this conversation into two parts, the first part being kind of the news today about a national inquiry, and then the second part can be actually the details of what Baroness Casey says in her report. So in terms of this inquiry, what has Louise Casey asked the government to do at a national level that looks like an inquiry?
Well, she wants an inquiry with teeth. She wants a statutory inquiry which has the ability to compel people to give evidence. I think, though, the devil around this is going to be in the detail. What I understand it to mean, and it's only just a short time since we've had the report published and the government response, is that it will have an umbrella arrangement, if you like, run by a single chair and a commission which enables local inquiries to feed into the national findings, the national hearings, so that the local detail isn't lost. And that's really critical. You know, I spent time talking to survivors of grooming, and one of them in particular said to me that she supported the idea of a public inquiry, but she was really worried that her particular individual case would get lost in that sea of information because of the scale that this is now known to be. And this was a woman I spoke to in Bradford. Here I am in Oldham. I've covered this story in Rochdale, you know, Huddersfield, Telford. It's everywhere. And so there have been concerns that a national inquiry could, if it's unlimited, with unlimited scope and an unlimited time frame, run away with itself and ultimately kick all of this down the road for more years with great expense and no real resolution, and that's what nobody wants. So this particular inquiry, and the way I think that Baroness Casey has proposed it, is that it will have a local element to it. That's certainly what the government announcement seems to suggest.
My reading of Baroness Casey's report is that, this national inquiry wouldn't be like the COVID inquiry or the infected blood inquiry or the child abuse inquiry, where it takes a lot of years and there's a lot of lawyers and cases and a retired judge, and they take over a building for years and it takes years for them to write up their report. It sounds like this is more almost like a hit squad that will look at particular areas where it seems to have been a problem and where there's been a lack of accountability, for example, amongst local authorities or children's services.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's how it feels. But there is still, a lot of detail to get into. We don't know who the ultimate chair will be. And actually, one of the campaigners who's been so vocal on all of this, Maggie Oliver, whose name I'm sure is familiar to you, former detective from Greater Manchester Police, turned whistleblower, and now she runs a foundation to support survivors of grooming. She said to us that she believes that a lot of survivors, and she herself, will only have confidence in this inquiry if it's led by Louise Casey. There are many who say that they feel Louise Casey is the first person to get to grips with what's going on in her report. It's been warmly received. But in terms of the inquiry, will it be a hit squad the way you've outlined it? Will it be efficient? Will it happen within a set-piece time frame? That's what the government has suggested, that it will be within a time frame. They say they don't want to rerun the 7-year-long independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, ICSA. Now, that had a much wider remit, to be fair. That wasn't just dealing with victims and survivors of group-based offending, grooming gangs, essentially. But there is an acceptance, I think, that ran for many years. And of course, it generated 20 recommendations, which have been very slow to be implemented. They're still in the process of starting with that. And so there are people saying, what will be the point if all we end up with here is another inquiry generating more recommendations and a report that sits on a shelf in Whitehall? It has to lead to effective change.
And let's hear a little bit now from Louise Casey, Baroness Casey, the author of this report. And here she is being interviewed a little bit earlier on Monday afternoon by my colleague Ben Wright, political correspondent and Radio 4 presenter. And he said to her, well, hang on, the government said there wasn't going to be an inquiry, that there was going to be these 5 local inquiries taking place on a much smaller scale. And also it sounded like she hadn't been in favour of a statutory national inquiry either. So what changed? And then Baroness Casey explained very clearly what she'd found out in the last few weeks, the last few months, that made her come to this conclusion today. So here's what she said.
I was with many people at the beginning of this. I thought to myself, we've had one massive national inquiry. It took years. It was very good. And the job was to getting on with implementing the recommendations. And actually, you know, sort of joking aside, as it were, I also thought, do we really need to spend a great deal of money that we probably don't have on something like more lawyers' fees, really? But then during the course of the last 3 or 4 months, it became absolutely clear to me. I think I've surprised people actually in Downing Street and beyond in some ways, that, you know, the reluctance of local areas to face up to the facts that they didn't treat victims well enough, that they haven't accepted that they have failings. And so from things like the announcement of the 5 local reviews, only Oldham Council came forward and said, yes, we better get on and do one. Nobody else did. So there's a reluctance there. Then I looked at they're called quality assurance reviews that were done in Greater Manchester under Andy Burnham, Mayor Andy Burnham up there, and realised again that people were fighting over whether they could share data. They made the reviewer's life a complete misery, and eventually they abandoned doing the last piece of work because they couldn't get people to cooperate with it. So I've arrived at a point, based on what I know to do with the whole of the audit, not just those 2 things I've mentioned to you, but more generally, that we've really got to grip this. And part of gripping it is obviously going for a national criminal investigation, but we also need to look at accountability locally, and we can't just let that happen in 1,000 different ways. The government has to grip that.
And we're joined now in the studio by the BBC Social Affairs editor, Alison Holt. Hi, Alison.
Hi there.
So, yeah, what's your understanding of what this national inquiry will look like? My theory to Judith was that it will not look like the COVID inquiry or the infected blood inquiry. It's quite a different sort of thing that Louise Casey's suggesting here.
Yes, I agree. I think it's quite an interesting concept, because what it seems to be is those local inquiries with the legal powers to compel witnesses to give evidence, but also with this sort of overarching framework provided by a national inquiry, so that national inquiry can make sure that it's best practice, that if there's, I guess it's got more weight, hasn't it? So that's my understanding of this, but it's going to be a bit of time before we get the full details. And as you know, Adam, the devil's always in the detail.
Yeah, exactly what Judith was just saying. It's interesting politically, because the people who were calling for a national inquiry earlier on this year, for example, Elon Musk, will be able to say, oh, there is going to be a national inquiry now. This is what we were asking for. But I don't think it is necessarily what a lot of those people were asking for, just because of the nuances that we've just explained. And equally, the government will be accused of dragging their heels and then finally agreeing to a national inquiry. But they will also be able to argue that, no, they're not setting up a big statutory kind of COVID-style inquiry that their critics were calling for. Sort of, you can cut this multiple ways.
You can. And I guess the test of any inquiry, for it to be worth its salt, it has to lead to action, and it has to lead to change. And there are certainly amongst many of the survivor groups that I've spoken to in recent months, this feeling that they don't want to be bogged down in years of an inquiry without seeing real change on the ground. And I imagine that Baroness Casey was very aware of that in the way in which she's set up this national inquiry.
Right, let's talk about the report now, because lots of newscasters will not have the time that we've had to look at it today, or the background of reporting on this for decades, as you two have had. Judith, shall we start off with just one word, actually, which appears throughout the report and has its own chapter, and the word is denial. What's Baroness Casey getting at with that?
Well, she is known as being somebody who doesn't pull her punches, and she was referring and specifically zooming in on the issue of ethnicity. And the point that she makes, actually, even before you get into this zooming in, if you like, the broader point she makes is about the fact that she has been prevented, I think, from fulfilling the the ultimate remit of what she was supposed to be doing with this audit, in that, to get a full feel of the scale of and nature and kind of offending and the background of the people responsible for it, because the data is so incomplete across the piece. And when it comes to the ethnicity of offenders, she described it as appalling and a serious failure, that 2/3 of perpetrators do not have their ethnicity recorded. Now, that said, she did take evidence from 3 police forces in the north of England, from South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester Police, which covers where I am here in Oldham, and there was enough evidence from those forces to take her down the road, enough to be able to say that there is a disproportionate number of offenders, of perpetrators, who originate from Pakistani heritage, Asian heritage backgrounds. And actually, one of the survivors who I spoke to, a woman called Fiona Godard, who has waived her anonymity, she was entitled to anonymity as a victim of sexual offences, and she has waived that anonymity to speak publicly because she lives in Bradford, and she said to me, this is a town, a city Bradford, that has escaped really huge amounts of criticism and exploration, and I know, she said, it's a huge problem here, but we were never particularly examined. There hasn't been an inquiry into our city. And when I asked her about her experience, well, she's had convictions. 9 men have been convicted related to her, but she estimates that about 50 or more men were responsible for abusing her over a 5-year period. And when I asked her about the origin of those men and their ethnicity, she said to me that they were nearly all of Pakistani heritage. And that is a subject, she thinks, that has been such a hot potato that it's prevented her case and others being dealt with, her being looked after. She said there was a complete reluctance for many years for anybody in her city to get to grips with what was happening.
Every single one of them were Pakistani, apart from one who was an Algerian, and the men that I know abused multiple other victims across England, the vast majority were Pakistani men.
Do you feel that the sensitivity around that topic has prevented the authorities from being able to help you?
Yes, I do not believe it was just a misunderstanding and not understanding the crime or the victims. I think that the crime was allowed to happen, 1, because of the race of the perpetrators, and 2, because of who the victims were.
Yeah, Alison, what's your take on what Louise Casey has said about ethnicity?
Well, I think she is saying it as she sees it. And it's worth remembering that in 2015, she carried out a report into Rotherham, into the council's handling of allegations of exploitation and grooming. That followed a year on from Alexis Jay, who, if you like, exposed the full scale of what was happening in that area. And she was highly critical and of the lack of the way in which the local authority had not addressed issues around ethnicity. It's that denial that she talks about in this report. And it seems to me, going back 10 years later, and not just looking at it in Rotherham, but looking at it across the country, she's found similar attitudes. And I think there's a really interesting point she makes. She says, without reliable information about ethnicity, and the government now says it will collect that information. Without reliable information, she argues there's a vacuum which different sides can use to suit the ends of those presenting it. And in a sense, with a lot of the arguments we saw in January, even now, a lot of those arguments, when you don't really know quite what you're dealing with in terms of numbers and what it means, it's very easy for everyone to make it fit what they want.
And that's the thing that's really struck me today reading this report, because whenever we talked about this issue over the last 10 years, we went to people in position of authority who had access to better data than we could do as just members, because we're just members of the public at the end of the day. And these people in authority said, no, the data suggests that there aren't certain ethnic groups overrepresented in these crimes, and we took them at face value, when actually a lot of those people should have been saying, we don't know, because the data doesn't tell us, because it's really patchy, because in a lot of places it's not collected. That would have been a more accurate thing for those authority figures to have told you, me and Judith.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, some have said the data's not very good. There have been some health warnings on the data, but overall there has been this, well, the data doesn't tell us that. And it just shows if you're only collecting a third of cases, information about a third of cases, actually you don't know a huge amount about the big picture, about all the cases and what that means. And, you know, if we're going to tackle this and change attitudes and protect children, because again, that is what Louise Casey has said so clearly. We are talking about children here. If we're going to protect them, we need to know the scale of the problem, the most likely offenders, or what the triggers are to offending, and then how we protect people.
And basically, Baroness Casey's big recommendation alongside the inquiry and alongside better data is actually more research into the patterns of these crimes and what leads people to do them and what sorts of groups we're talking about. Judith, just back to that question I asked you a minute ago about that chapter that's called Denial. I mean, Baroness Casey talks about people who have effectively covered this up, either intentionally or unintentionally in some cases.
Yeah, that's a feature of this scandal, and key to that. I think that is what the inquiry will deal with, the accountability. That's what, when you speak to people like Maggie Oliver campaigning, that is what they are most exercised by. Although, you know, you could talk to a range of different people, of different survivors, of campaigners, and they will each want something different at the end of the day from this process. One of the other things which I was interested in seeing in the report was that one of the recommendations is for the re-examination of the convictions of survivors who have themselves ended up being prosecuted. That's something which is extraordinary when you hear the testimony of often young girls who were treated themselves as culpable. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for a cultural change, a shift change in how everybody involved is treated. You know, I think the other thing which stood out for me was that Baroness Casey said there's been a cycle of, you know, she sees repeated cycles of scandal, followed by outrage, followed by a burst of activity and focus from the government, and another inquiry or a report, and then really no sustained difference. And so the test here is going to be whether all of these measures that we're discussing now, changes to the law, the national inquiry, the national police operation, which has been announced today as well, the treatment of survivors, listening to their voices, looking at convictions where necessary, looking into online grooming, because that's been a shift change in the way this happens, that it's just as likely now to be something which goes on online, out of sight, in bedrooms, on phones. You know, all of that is part of the picture, but ultimately the real test here is going to be, as Alison said before, if today is a real watershed moment and it leads to sustained and permanent change and not just another burst of activity and a dusty report on a Whitehall shelf.
Judith, thank you very much. I'm going to let you go because I know you've got lots of other news to do this evening, so thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
And Alison, just in terms of other concrete things that Louise Casey has recommended, she wants a very clear change in the law about how rape is handled when it's a rape victim or survivor under the age of 16.
Yeah,
just explain that.
So, as I understand it, she wants the law toughened up so that if there is a case where there has been penetrative sex with a child under the age of 16, then there will be a prosecution. There's no question for rape. There will be a prosecution for rape. The area where it has been tricky, I mean, I think that's arguable, but the area where there have been problems in the past is that the relationships are what they're described as relationships, whereas in fact it is a form of abuse.
Yeah, the police may have treated it like an older boyfriend and a younger girlfriend, so therefore it's not really rape, it's a different crime. And she's basically saying if an adult man has sex with a child, that should be rape. That should never be sort of interpreted as, oh, maybe there you could understand why it happened.
I'll give you an example of a young woman I spoke to a couple of weeks ago who is a survivor of sexual exploitation. And she was in a children's home, and when she was hanging around outside the children's home with another young girl, was, as she put it, chatted up by two young men. And she said the staff could see what was happening. They could see us talking to them and how this was developing, and they didn't say anything about it. So she says that she thought it was okay. Now that led her down the steps towards a really nasty, exploitative, abusive set of circumstances. And interestingly, again, with her, when it came to trying to get someone to listen, a serious case review afterwards found that she had tried to tell police, health workers, social workers on 25 occasions what was happening to her. And in the end, the only way she got someone to listen was she actually set fire to bins outside the children's home. It just shows the extremity of the situation that she was facing and the difficulty of getting people to listen.
One of the other things that has struck me today is just how much our language as a society has changed. Like, it's not that long ago, and Louise Casey said this in her chat with Ben Wright, that you had judges in court talking about, quote, wayward girls, when actually they were the victims of child sexual exploitation and sexual abuse and sexual assault and rape. And actually, you'd have quite reputable media outlets not that long talking about the idea of child prostitutes.
Yeah.
And it's like all that's been consigned to the dustbin now, because this is put it all in black and white. It's given us this report has given us all a kind of new collective language to talk about it. Of course, you've had access to that language for a while because you've been meeting these people for ages. I just think now society wide we've kind of got, this sets a new baseline for how we talk about this, really.
It does, but the thing I would say is I think we have known that for well over a decade. The language has changed a long time ago.
Yeah.
But sadly, our attitudes haven't kept up with that. And certainly the actions of authorities have not kept up with that. And that's basically what Louise Casey is saying. She's saying, we know what the problems are. We have seen this pattern of behaviour. And she even points to other reports saying, these set out these same sorts of details that I'm setting out, but there still hasn't been change.
Alison, thank you very much.
Nice to see you again.
And now let's have a quick catch up with Chris, who's in Canada at the G7 summit of the world's richest countries. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
We'll talk about diplomacy in a second, and I know that's where your focus has been, rather than on the Louise Casey review, which I'm sure you'll massively get into when you get back, because it's going to be a running story for a long time. But you were there for when this chapter of the story started on Saturday morning.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we were on the plane to Ottawa, the Canadian capital, which we popped into on the way here to pretty much the West Coast, not quite the Rockies, and Alberta for the G7. And we were doing the huddle, as it's known, where the Prime Minister wanders to the back of the plane and all of us lot who are at the back huddle in this kind of semicircle, trying to lean our ears towards the Prime Minister. It's quite hard to hear when you're on a plane. And we all get a chance to ask one question, but there's about 30 of us, so you get about 30 questions. Whole thing had gone on for probably about half an hour when someone asked a question about child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, and then the Prime Minister says, well, I've read all of Baroness Casey's report and I agree with it. I agree with the idea that there should be a full national statutory inquiry in England and Wales, and in so doing, at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, he performs this huge U-turn on where he was just a handful of months ago. Now, he says he's driven by the evidence, and he made the argument to us that Baroness Casey had also changed her view, having looked at what she's been looking into over the last couple of months. But yeah, there you had it, this about turn from the Prime Minister. I think it was always quite likely, depending on what Baroness Casey concluded, that he might come to this position, because the political pressure for a full inquiry was not going away, and what Baroness Casey was doing in looking into this was, yes, looking into it, but also potentially providing a kind of political ladder down which the Prime Minister could climb. So it's not that surprising, but it is nonetheless quite the about turn.
And I suppose the Prime Minister's not really been getting into it today on Monday. That's been something for Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, and for the House of Commons, because he's off doing like big geopolitics stuff at a time when there's a lot of big geopolitics.
Yeah, totally. So let me paint a picture of where I am right now, Adam. In front of me is this impossibly tall, entirely straight pine tree in a forest of pine trees that run as high as the tree line. And then above the tree line, the Rocky Mountains. I've not been here before. You very quickly get a sense of why they're called the Rockies, because the rock is bare and it is incredibly high. I can see up to the snow line as well on the horizon. Blue sky here today. It's lunchtime as I speak to you, 10 to midday. What is it, 10 to 7, where you are. The summit's just getting underway here. Formally, Prime Minister's met a fair number of the leaders face to face. He's going to meet Donald Trump in a couple of hours, about 9 o'clock in the evening, your time on Monday evening. And yeah, clearly a huge amount of focus on what's happening in the Middle East. But you have a collection of countries here, Adam, who don't agree. Their instincts are different. So you've got a bunch of countries like the UK who are talking about de-escalation. You've got a country like Japan that has been much, much more critical publicly of Israel. And then you've got Donald Trump, who has been, who described Israel's actions as excellent. So can the other countries perform enough kind of leverage on Donald Trump to manoeuvre him into a place where he can, exact some influence on Benjamin Netanyahu? I think that's the sort of dynamics of the next couple of days here, I think.
Yeah, we can just have a listen now to the Prime Minister reiterating that his position is that both sides should de-escalate.
Well, it is really important that we focus on de-escalation because the risks of the conflict escalating are obvious across the region and beyond the region. The impact that this could and probably will have on Gaza, which is a tinderbox, and of course the impact on the economy. That is why at the G7 there's such a focus on de-escalation. That'll be an intense discussion for our talks today, but we have to find a way to de-escalate this situation, notwithstanding the concerns that we all have about the nuclear program. There's no doubt about that. Notwithstanding, we all accept Israel's right to self-defense, of course, but there must be de-escalation.
And Chris, we should just say, away from the kind of big geopolitics of this, just some practicalities from the government today for British nationals or British citizens who are in Israel and feel like they're kind of in the line of fire now.
Yeah, they are the key details that we've learnt actually today. It is exactly that, the practicalities. So the Prime Minister telling us that an online portal is being set up. In fact, by the time you're listening to Newscast, it may well be live. And this is a online vehicle via which British nationals in Israel can register their presence, to use the Foreign Office's language. In other words, tell the Foreign Office who they are and where they are. And in addition to that, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy has said that a team has been deployed to Egypt. They are basically trying to make it as easy as possible, up to a point I think at this stage, for British nationals who want to leave Israel to be able to leave. They're not using the language of evacuation or anything like that, but they're clearly doing what they can to help Brits to leave who want to leave. The picture in Iran is much more complicated. There is an embassy, a British embassy, that is functioning in Iran, but there's an acknowledgement that providing support for people there is much more difficult. The numbers, though, are I think, much, much smaller there, given the long-standing kind of diplomatic difficulties, to put it mildly, between the UK and Iran. But yeah, a focus on those practicalities, Adam, with, joining the dots, every prospect that might step up if things continue to deteriorate.
And Chris, just to go back to the diplomacy, do we think we're going to have a bilat, as it's known in the trade, when the two men sit down between Trump and Starmer? Because I'm just thinking the last time they did that in the Oval Office and you were there, I mean, that seems like a whole epoch ago.
It does really, doesn't it? Well, this is where we get into, and I know you love this, Adam, and I know newscasters love this. This is where we get into the joyous language, and I'm just pulling this up on my WhatsApp here to make sure that I do it justice. The joyous language of the descriptions that are attached to these different kind of meetings. So this is a kind of multilateral forum. So in other words, all of them around the same table at various points. But then also get the one-on-one meetings between the leaders. So there's the bilateral, which is the kind of biggest ticket one of these things, which is formal, and the cameras getting invited in at the top, and then there's what's known as a readout from both sides afterwards, in other words, where they give their own sort of public interpretation of what was talked about. You can also get brush bys, which I think we've talked about on Newscast before. There is a little more pacey, a little more informal. One I hadn't heard of today is a pull aside, which is what the Prime Minister and the President are having on Monday evening. It was described by someone who knows their way around the hierarchy of these things that a pull-aside is slightly longer and more formal than a brush by. The hierarchy goes by lat, pull aside, brush by. Marginal differences, though, between the final two, just slightly longer and more organised than a brush by, which is really just a quick hello. Now, I know that all sounds kind of, I don't know, a bit sort of ludicrous or even pathetic, really, but it does matter in the kind of hierarchy of diplomacy and the extent to which things can be talked about and discussed. One thing we are actually expecting, Adam, is the finalised details of the UK-US trade deal that was signed off a couple of weeks back. There's elements of that need nailing down, and the mood music suggests that's going to happen whilst we're here. Whether it happens in that pull aside, as we're now obliged to call it, let's see. But I think that's coming pretty soon.
Chris, thank you very much. And I can safely say we've just had a bilat.
That's definitely an Adam Chris bilat, yes. And readouts will be available later in the usual places.
No, you don't need a readout because everyone was present.
That was it.
We only need a readout
point.
when you're not there. Anyway, right.
Oh, I could never be a diplomat. I just couldn't do it.
Right, safe travels.
Ta-ra. Talk to you soon.
And I will talk to you again soon because that's it for this episode of Newscast, but there will be another one very soon. Bye-bye.